They called it an academy for the future, a sanctuary for extraordinary intelligence, for the kind of children who solved puzzles that adults couldn't even start. Parents saw prestige, the state saw potential. And yet, almost every trace of this place was erased. No graduation photos, no alumni records, just a few blurred images that look more like laboratory corridors than classrooms. Officially, nothing unethical happened. Unofficially, those who spent their childhood there insist that they were trained to think, feel, and obey in ways no child should. This was one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets, hidden under the harmless label of educational psychology. What happened inside that school still echoes through everything we know about learning, loyalty, and control. America, 1950s to 1970s. The superpower rivalry isn't just nuclear, it's psychological. If minds can be programmed, entire nations can be steered without war. The CIA's MK Ultra project is already experimenting with hypnosis, hallucinogens, and sleep deprivation. When those reports leak decades later, they focus on adult subjects: soldiers, prisoners, hospital patients. What almost no one mentions are the parallel studies involving adolescents. During the post-Sputnik panic, America's biggest fear was falling behind in intelligence. Funds pour into research promising to measure and enhance cognition. At least 3 separate departments, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, the Office of Naval Research, and certain CIA fronts, investigate ways to optimize youth learning resilience. Those studies blur into something else. Hidden among legitimate reform projects, a cluster of boarding schools begins operating under federal educational innovation grants. Their names vary, each bland enough to sound forgettable, but they share the same structure: total residential isolation and total data secrecy. Parents sign non-disclosure agreements, believing they're helping national security education. Few realize that behind those polished leaflets stood the same scientists who supplied data to intelligence agencies. Admission came through testing, long psychological inventories masked as IQ exams. Children were invited to pilot new cognitive environments. The transportation to campus was arranged by the state, one-way tickets, bus windows blackened for safety reasons. Inside, the world shrank to routines. Wake up, measure pulse, recite pledge, complete drills. Every reaction was charted. Laughter, hesitation, refusal. Letters home were encouraged but filtered. Many parents later received typed transcriptions instead of their child's handwriting. Some suspected nothing. Others noticed identical phrasing between letters supposedly written by different students. One surviving timetable details emotional normalization exercises at dawn. Groups stood in circles repeating a neutral phrase until voices became identical in tone. Correction for failure was simple isolation. 24 hours in a bright room with a white noise hum, temperature near freezing. It was presented as discipline, yet it matched published work by Dr. Cameron in Montreal describing psychic driving, the use of monotonous sensory environments to reset behavior. Teachers changed every semester. They used only initials. Several later appeared in unrelated government projects, studying human factors in spaceflight and interrogation resistance. Over time, children developed strange speech patterns, flat tone, pause before pronouns, avoidance of the word I. A psychology paper from 1966 refers obliquely to a group of subjects aged 10 to 14 who demonstrate self-reference suppression after instruction in emotional control. The author's funding acknowledgement cites the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the same front through which MK Ultra moved money. No one joined the dots at the time. By the mid-1960s, the curriculum shifted from intellect to obedience. Tests measured not just correctness, but the speed of compliance. A timer clicked. The slower a child obeyed an order, the colder the room became. Researchers recorded heartbeats, galvanic skin response, and eye dilations. Standard biofeedback now, but groundbreaking then. The data aimed to discover how authority could override emotion. Sleep cycles grew irregular. Fluorescent lights throbbed softly at night to stabilize circadian rhythms. In truth, they kept students in perpetual semi-wakefulness. After weeks, short-term memory declined. Suggestibility soared. That pattern appears again in declassified Navy studies on perceptual fatigue as a compliance amplifier. Around this period, mention of symbolic association drills appears in notes from a former instructor. Children were asked to link abstract symbols with reward or punishment until they responded reflexively. The technique would re-emerge decades later in behavior conditioning algorithms for advertising and learning software. Yet not all data fit the plan. A few students collapsed, panic attacks, mutism, uncontrollable laughter. One was transferred to a nearby hospital whose admission records were sealed by federal order. The next day, classmates were told she'd graduated early. No bodies ever turned up, but internal memos confirm multiple unanticipated terminations. When word of MK Ultra leaked to the press in the late 1970s, Congress launched hearings. Most documents had been shredded on Helms' orders 4 years earlier, but fragments survived. References to youth trials, to educational environments of isolation, to repatterning juveniles for resilience. Journalists chased clues towards several shuttered campuses listed under philanthropic trusts that evaporated weeks before subpoenas arrived. Locals remembered the demolition convoys, trucks arriving before dawn, removing heavy crates marked psych test material. By nightfall, bulldozers erased the buildings. No record of hazardous waste removal, no architectural permits. When survivors tried to reclaim medical files, the Department of Health cited national security exemptions. That phrase should never appear in an education case, but it did, repeatedly. Even now, FOIA requests for sub-projects 136 to 142 return with the same note: records non-existent or destroyed. Those missing numbers align perfectly with the years these schools operated. Decades later, fragments of the same language begin to reappear, only now in glossy presentations about cognitive enhancement. Corporate researchers speak of calibrated environments, of stress inoculation training. Defense departments fund adaptive behavior education for child prodigies heading into cyber warfare fields. Some of the consultants listed once studied under the educational psychology pioneers connected to MK Ultra. Names repeat, methods evolve. And then there are the personal echoes. Adults who attended gifted institutes in the 60s describe lifelong sensory anomalies. Insomnia cured only by static noise, aversion to darkness, an instinctive need for command structures. Therapists encounter clusters of patients from different states with nearly identical memories. White corridors, humming speakers, rewards for obedience, punishment for feelings. Memory contamination? Maybe. Or maybe some conditioning survives through decades, buried under rationalization. Let's line up what we actually know. We have real agencies, CIA, Department of Defense, Public Health Service, funding behavior modification. We have verifiable institutions like the Allen Memorial Institute performing experiments later condemned as unethical. We have missing sub-projects coinciding with educational trials. We have decades of alumni from untraceable federal academies showing identical psychological residue. Individually, coincidence. Together, they outline a shadow program hiding in plain sight behind the word school. Because where do you plant the seeds of obedience most effectively? In the classroom. As early as 1962, internal memoranda from the Office of Naval Research proposed pre-socialization frameworks for military readiness, testing if childhood discipline could reduce defection risk. The memo concludes, further study recommended with civilian intermediaries to avoid direct attribution. That's bureaucratic code for use private foundations. Soon after, funding records show such foundations distributing grants to residential youth research facilities. Their directors? Former consultants from intelligence psychological units. Behind all the acronyms stand people. One declassified interview transcript features a researcher confessing that subjects exhibited accelerated compliance but long-term affective flattening. In simpler words, they lost the ability to care. He adds, almost apologetically, the phenomenon was considered collateral. None of the children gave consent. Their parents believed in patriotic science, curing anxiety, improving learning, protecting the nation. Decades later, those same parents received polite letters thanking them for participation in adaptive education studies. No apology, no recognition. A former student described reuniting with an old classmate after 40 years. They tried recalling the school anthem. Halfway through, both froze mid-syllable, as if a switch had flipped. Neither could finish the tune. That's not fiction. It's documented in a therapeutic interview filed under the pseudonym Subject B12. When researchers played tones of a certain frequency, B12 involuntarily saluted. Cold War paranoia justified everything. Scientists talked about psychological containment. If the enemy could brainwash soldiers, America needed inoculation. The dream was noble in theory. Build minds impossible to manipulate by making them perfectly disciplined. But discipline shades quickly into obedience, and obedience into submission. The line disappears once fear of uncontrol becomes policy. By the time oversight committees realized what had happened, the data had already seeped into civilian sectors. Education, advertising, even entertainment. Concepts of attention shaping, behavioral reinforcement loops, emotional fatigue scheduling, all descendants of those early studies. Everywhere you see a system designed to hold your gaze or measure your reaction, part of that lineage lives on. If there was nothing to hide, why were all files destroyed? Why do the missing project numbers correspond to child-focused studies? Why did federal investigators warn journalists not to publish names, citing psychological national defense? And most haunting of all, what really happened to those who didn't adapt? Whistleblowers claim some were transferred to medical institutions for follow-up evaluation. Yet the receiving hospitals report no records. One researcher attempted to publish under pseudonym in 1981, writing, "They told us to measure potential. We ended up measuring obedience. When I protested, my credentials expired overnight." The deeper the trail goes, the clearer the motive. Secrecy wasn't about protecting the public from foreign enemies, but from its own reflection. Today, educational algorithms can predict emotional engagement to fractions of a second. Digital classrooms calibrate lighting, rhythm, and repetition to maintain focus. All justified as productivity. But listen closely to the wording of certain patents. Controlled stimulus deprivation for optimal response curves. Reinforcement scheduling under variable uncertainty. Those phrases are lifted almost verbatim from the MK Ultra technical glossary. The methods survived, only the rhetoric changed. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the school no one returned from the same. Techniques refined on children now shape societies, quietly, invisibly, efficiently. Officially, there were no secret schools, no classified classes of human ecology. The files say so. The textbooks confirm it. Yet, the facts that remain, the destroyed archives, the missing project numbers, the identical recollections, paint a different picture, one that fits perfectly between fact and nightmare. The Cold War is over, but its experiments never truly ended. They evolved, digitized, and disguised themselves as progress. And the generation that once believed it was being educated to protect freedom may have been engineered to redefine what freedom feels like. So when you hear about the next Elite Youth Initiative, remember, sometimes history doesn't repeat, it just updates its cover sheet. Because once you teach obedience at the level of instinct, you never need to enforce it again. The official story remains clean, but in the margins of declassified pages, faint under the black ink, certain words still tremble. Juvenile subjects, controlled environment, results promising. No ending note, no closure, just the quiet hum of fluorescent light that never goes out. Tell me which other buried chapter you want unearthed next. Because as long as archives stay sealed, the darkest lessons of history will keep pretending to be education.